Hello.
It seems wrong.
It's all wrong. It gets more wrong each time
Every
we do
time we
this.
do it. Is this how we do this? Is this how I sit? Is this where the microphone is?
All right, Dan.
Move this around a bit.
I made a note. Well, I made two notes.
Uh-huh.
Not physically, so I'm already lying.
Mental notes.
Mental notes, thank
Okay.
you. Two important things to get to, Dan.
Okay.
One much more important than the other, and we'll get to that last. But first of all, your queen is dead, Dan.
I thought that was going to be the most important thing.
You'd think. It's an update, actually, and it's very good news. But we'll
The
get to
queen is
that
still
later.
dead.
The
Oh, the
queen is
update.
dead. Yeah, exactly.
The update is the queen is still dead.
Queen, still dead. I'm only bringing that up because we're in England and everybody seems to be talking about it. And as I've been saying, the wheat has been being separated from the chaff, and we're seeing who
I
are
don't know
closet
what that
sickos.
means. Oh, right. I see.
We're seeing, who are the people who are upset, who are the people that are going to London. I got a notification on my phone for some reason that the queue to see the Queen has exceeded 3 miles.
Okay.
It's fucking
Yeah, they were talking
insane.
about 30 hours or
It's
something.
disgusting. It's
Yeah.
sick. I was thinking about how funny it would be to just be like an American tourist family who like happened to be in like London now, and they're like, "Oh, let's go
one of
down to
those famous
Buckingham
British
Palace."
queues.
Yeah, we'll go down to Buckingham Palace and see the Queen, and they're like, "Where's the back of the line?" And they're like, "Oh, it's like East London." It's like, fuck off.
Also, the queen is at Parliament at the moment, so
Oh, she's in Parliament.
yeah,
Huh. That's odd.
yeah.
Well,
And
whatever.
one of the tabloid newspapers yesterday had the headline because she came down from Scotland. This is such a weird way of phrasing it. How do we do it better? The coffin was brought down from Scotland. It went to Buckingham Palace last night, and one of the tabloid headlines was like, "Home for the final time." Or something. I was just like, this is really
Yeah,
gross.
that's
Just sort of
gross.
like,
Well,
I don't know.
We fetishize the Queen.
It's sycophantic.
It is. Is there not part of you though? Because here's where I stand, Dan. Not having grown up with this stuff, I really don't care. The people who are like, the Queen's dead, yes, like really don't care. I don't care what these people do. I don't care who lives. I don't care who dies. It's all just very like whatever to me. But this guy, you grew up with it. There's got to be part of it that's like, this is weird. The Queen's dead. Or she was 96.
I think I probably thought it was going to feel weirder than it actually was. You are right to gesture at that. Like it is a significant thing. But I feel like she's been like disappearing from the limelight for such a long time. Like she hasn't been on the news. She hasn't been central to British constitutional life, I suppose. And we've been prepared for this.
We have.
Yeah. Why was I not as shocked as I may well have been? I don't know.
Yeah.
I think I was off on a holiday in another world,
Yeah, and you were just
doing
like, whatever.
things. I was like, oh. And then I came back and like, so I went away for a few weeks, sort of like a little bit separated from like normal reality.
To do some things up in Balmoral.
And I came back from that experience, and reality always feels a bit weird anyway.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying.
So
yeah.
like, I just came back to
A country without a queen.
a country with a queen, a country with a king. I mean,
with a
God
king,
Save the
ugh.
King as a national anthem is probably going to take a little while to get used to.
Wow, yeah, you got to change the anthem. That's
Yeah.
weird. That's
I don't know. I'm into it. Why not?
Okay.
Let's give him give him. I tell you what I've been thinking. Actually, I suppose I've been, aside from the fact of like, okay, I'm not going to like celebrate the death of a 96-year-old
sure.
woman, right? Like maybe when Margaret Thatcher died, I had some sympathy for like reveling
Tramping
in
on
the
the
streets
graves
and
and
whatever,
whatnot.
and like full solidarity with that. Like, you see that woman in Glasgow, the chip shop owner that like posted a video on like TikTok or something of her like spraying champagne everywhere and celebrating,
Jesus
and then a
Christ.
mob descended on her chip shop and
Fair enough.
sprayed ketchup all over. I don't know. Anyway,
This is
yeah,
too
and
much.
like I have solidarity with her,
Sure.
I suppose. But generally, I don't. I'm finding it difficult to generate malice, or
yeah.
like jubilant sentiments.
Yeah.
But I also feel like maybe I've sort of imbued some propaganda.
Oh, no.
But I also feel like I don't feel like, I feel a bit disgusted, I suppose, by the idea of a hereditary monarchy.
Sure.
And you and I are much more substantively disgusted, I think, by the continued existence of the aristocracy and the sort of like regime of property ownership in this country and blah 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 whatever. I think that's more offensive, just the general existence of the aristocracy as opposed to the existence of a hereditary monarchy, whatever. But it is a ceremonial function that she fulfills. If there's a point of like, I suppose if there was an aspect of the Constitution I was going to want to challenge, it's probably less that so much as like an unelected House of Lords or any number of other aspects of the Constitution or the electoral system or the arrangement of so many other things. Yeah. So there's a kind of like an instinctive opposition to republicanism, to monarchism, and a sort of like intuition toward republicanism. But I guess so many of the arguments that I'm seeing presented for republicanism at the moment are kind of like feel a bit inherently liberal in their sort of thrust of the argument, and I'm not motivated by it particularly. I suppose there is a question of like I've heard the question raised of what does this mean for like British self-conception. How have we been like living in this perpetual like, I mean, Britain has been a declining empire, and this woman has overseen the decline of this empire in a supposedly like, I guess in a way which maintains some amount of continuity, such that certain aspects or certain parts of the British psyche and some people in this country can sort of maintain some kind of semblance of Great Britain and its importance in the world and blah 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 blah. What is this gonna mean now that she's died? Now that we have to reckon with Charles III, now we have to actually meet some of these other characters in the royal family and sort of like try to imagine them in this role and try and conceptualize contemporary Britain, a collective we here kind of thing. How is this country gonna cope?
How will it cope? Indeed.
Hopefully not well.
Hopefully we get some dissonance. I don't know. Like I said, I just simply don't care.
She's been dead for years anyway.
She's been dead for years, as we always say. Queen's dead. What are you going to do? I wonder if they like pull aside new monarchs and they're like, what archetype do you wish to fulfill in like your public facing function? Because like Queen Elizabeth was very much like, I don't think I ever saw her display any like emotion. And I don't mean that as like a dig. It's just like, I only ever saw her, and this might just be because I'm not from here, but like giving speeches and just being like, here is this, and just performing official functions, and that's it. Like never really saw her do anything. So she was very much like blank canvas for all of these sickos to be like, she was so great. And it's like, why? She might have been, I don't know. She might have been a really nice lady. She spawned some good pedophiles. That's her lasting legacy, I guess. I have no idea. But
allegedly.
Like, allegedly spawned alleged pedophiles. But I don't know. Who cares? It's like, anyway, the new guy, I'd like to see some, I don't know, Charles II, when he came in, he was like, I'm going to be the party guy. We're getting the monarchy back going. I'd like to see another party guy. That's what I'm saying. He's not coming across too well so far. It seems like he's coming across like a bit of a prick, I'll be honest, right now. Because like as he was signing the papers, he like shooed his butler away and snarled at him. And it's like, ooh, not a good start. But maybe that's his archetype, prick. We could use a prick king, I think. Whatever. Second news, Dan, the much more important news. The listener will remember a while ago, Dan and I had a fellow named Bobby on from the excellent podcast Tipping Pitches to discuss minor league unionization in Major League Baseball. It has happened, Dan. There is now a minor league union, which is insane. And the insane part about it is that they're basically joining the MLBPA, which is crazy because like minor league players, go listen to our episode, have had to put up with a lot of really bad shit, sometimes making like less than 10 grand a year, sleeping on floors with like 5 guys, not getting good food, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're part of the MLBPA right now, which is really, really cool. The MLBPA also just signed up with the AFL-CIO, which is crazy. I don't really understand what that means, but that seems nuts. And Major League Baseball, Dan, voluntarily recognized them, which seems crazy. No one was expecting them to do that. But the commissioner, Rob Manfred, I think was bought on specifically because he used to be a labor lawyer. So I think the thinking is that he kind of was like, listen, guys, if we voluntarily recognize them now, we can kind of like get them somewhere down the line instead of trying to fight the inevitable. So we'll see what comes of that. It is really good news. Hopefully we'll see some like improvements in living conditions and pay for those guys. But yeah, just thought I'd bring that up because the name of that episode was Unionize the Minor Leagues, and it's happened. So cool.
We did it.
We did it. We did it, folks. Good stuff.
No, I had no idea.
Yeah.
Congratulations to all involved, I suppose.
Yeah, and it was funny because they like balloted because there's like this long process for like starting a union, and they balloted people, and everybody was like yes. It's like, okay, cool. Look at that. The summer of discontent goes on and on. There are some potential train strikes that we could talk about, I guess. There are some train strikes in Australia, but I don't know. That would be a whole nother can of worms to open up. Let's just keep saying things continue to heat up in this world of ours, Dan. And speaking of a heating up world, climate change, ecology, we're back. Wow, we put it off as long as we can, Dan. We got to talk about the second part of this book. So we're back, listener. We're reading Jason W. Moore's Capitalism and the Web of Life. We did not finish it this time. We read part 2, Historical Capitalism, Historical Nature. We started with the introduction in part 1 about 4 weeks ago, something like that, 2 episodes ago, I think, something like that. So go back and listen to that one. But yeah, we're back. And I dug it. It was really good. We were just saying right before we started recording that this could be a bit frustrating to read, this book. But if you can kind of get through some of the repetition and kind of, I wouldn't exactly say it's complicated. It's just like pretty dense, I suppose. You'll really be rewarded with some really exciting ideas that I kind of find at least pretty refreshing, especially when we talk about Marxist ecology. So before we kind of get into it, I suppose, what did you make of this second part?
Yeah, it was enjoyable to read. So yeah, I think I agree with you. We did a lot of speculating last time on what we think his theory of crisis might be.
Yeah.
I mean, the first 3 chapters of this kind of touched on it, and this subsequent 3 chapters, this part 2, is largely around that idea of introducing, conceptualizing an idea of capitalist crisis, which contains within it the implications of capitalism's relationship to ecology, and what he introduces the double internality in the first 3 chapters. So not the separateness of nature and capitalism, but rather their dialectical interconnectedness. And we are introduced to multiple new dialectics in these 3 chapters, which I'm not sure we're going to make head and tails of, but
the old college tried.
Yes, indeed.
The old college tried.
Yes, please give us some leniency.
This is very much us learning along with the listener, who won't have read this, which will make them even more confused. But hey, we'll give it a go. So yeah, you're right. The first episode, we might want to go back a bit and just say that, like, you're right. The first episode was definitely concerned with the idea that, like, a lot of past and present thinking about capitalism has been framed by this, as you're saying, like this kind of dualism. This idea that, like, it's all framed by separating capitalism out of nature, even labor out of nature. And basically saying it's like capitalism acting upon nature, or on the other end, this is all just like nature acting on capitalism, man. Like, where's the agency? And of course, Moore, like, comes, as you say, like with his double internality, the oikios, he comes up with this whole new theoretical framework to basically say that we're all in this web of life, man. And it's capitalism acting on nature, but it's also nature. Well, no, it's capitalism acting through nature, I suppose is what he would say, but it's also nature acting through capitalism. It's all very dialectical. So anyway, this episode and this part, he goes in quite a bit more to talk about, like, reapproaching the historical dynamics of capitalism, I suppose, and all of its contradictions by, like, using this holistic thinking. And he talks, as you say, about, like, these crises. He talks about crises of underproduction and overproduction, and how capitalism and nature kind of, like, interconnect with each other. And I didn't realize, do you know if he coined the phrase for every Manchester and Mississippi? I think he did, because I've heard it before. And he doesn't like cite anything here. He doesn't put it in quotes or whatever. So I think he came up with that. So he gets into that idea quite a bit as well, which we'll go into. But yeah, I found it really exciting and fresh and quite convincing. There's one thing that I think we can get to that I'm a little bit kind of unsure about like this emphasis, but yeah, it's quite good.
Yeah, I wonder whether a good starting point for us might be how he fits his notions of the relationship between capitalism and ecology into the kind of history of capitalism. We sort of hinted last time that he takes quite an early starting point for capitalism, and it's later on in this book he's going to go into much more detail about it, so we might not get into it right now, but he sort of talks about like a long 16th century or something as the sort of like origin point of capitalism, because so much of what he recognizes to be the dynamics of capitalism are present there. But he sees capitalism and its history as a series of quite protracted waves of growth and decline, and then new growth again. He identifies like 5 or 6 as the come from this long 16th century onwards kind of thing, which he ties into the relationship between capitalism and nature, and capitalism's ability to exploit the free and cheap gifts of nature, whether they're in the form of work done by nature or energy contributed by nature kind of thing. Because if we recall last time, one of the things that he talks about, which an idea that I'd never really come across before, was this idea that although capitalism, like in a Marxist sense, like values things predicated on the work done by the labourer internal to the sort of like commodity money circuit of capitalism, right? That's how the determination of what things are worth is done by capitalism, whether it knows it or not, in Marx's and then in Moore's reinterpretation of Marx. But Moore is suggesting that far more significant in a sort of quantitative sense of the inputs to capitalism, far more important is these things which are almost external from it. What he talks about as being like capitalism's process of appropriating from nature kind of thing. And he describes this sort of cyclical process of like boom and crisis and boom and crisis kind of thing.
Series of like accumulation cycles and things like that, and about when you have these accumulation crises and underproduction crises, overproduction crises, about the thing that saves it is reorganizing. And he kind of talks about how he borrows a lot of this from Origi and I guess a bit from Harvey. I didn't really understand that bit, but about how it's able to find these new frontiers of things that capitalism is able to appropriate. And it gets into what he said in the beginning, which I found very moving. He quotes somebody as saying, the only thing worse than being exploited is being appropriated. And that's to basically say, if you exploit labor, that's wage labor. That's what we have now. But if you appropriate labor, that's slavery, right? And so he draws this out, and it is very inspired by like feminist critiques and stuff, like ecofeminism, radical feminism, and stuff like that, to talk about the 4 cheaps. And we went over this last episode, but I think that this is kind of getting into maybe like some stuff where I'm like a little bit kind of unsure of. This is the one thing. Because he talks about how like capitalism relies on appropriation, and specifically it needs these 4 cheaps, which we talked about last episode: cheap food, cheap energy, cheap labor, and cheap raw materials, right? And he says that that's kind of like the base of the base, right? So like you have base and superstructure, which is like, obviously like the economic base, the social base that determines like the political structure, cultural structure, things like that. But then like beneath that, for any of this to even happen, you have to have like cheap natures, and you have to have like the oikios operating in such a way that it's able to appropriate at things, appropriating them like not at their fair price or whatever, whatever. But I think that like maybe in him doing that, I wanted to ask you this. Do you think that him privileging like the appropriation of like unpaid work and energy, like, do you think he does that maybe a bit too much? Because like, I don't know, what I'm thinking is that the oikios or whatever isn't unique to capitalism in any way. There is like a way of interacting with nature that all modes of productions have had, right? And so when you talk about like the base of the base as being like being able to appropriate freely from nature, that's really the base of capitalism. I don't know. I'm a little bit unsure about that, because it's like, well, the thing that's making this oikios like so bad or whatever, that's making us appropriate so much and at such an unsustainable rate, is the base from base and superstructure, right? Like it is the mode of production. It is like this economic way. It is wage labor. It's the value form, the commodity or whatever. So like I'm a bit, when he says that like, here's the thing we really need to be focusing on, man, is like the nature and the cheap things here. I'm a little bit like, well, kind of. But it's like you would still have an oikios or whatever in socialism. There would still be a way of interacting with nature. But the thing that determines how sustainable or whatever that's going to be is maybe like your economic mode of organization, or at least like Yeah, I don't know. Hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, I think it did. I'm not 100% sure. I think he definitely. It's not as though he is overlooking fundamental critiques of capitalism.
Sure.
He's certainly pointing the blame at capitalism's requirement to seek greater and greater profits, kind of thing. And also, he definitely defines the internal workings of capitalism in a way that one would recognize from Marx, I suppose.
Sure.
As I say, he recognizes like the law of value, but he then sort of amends it in some particular ways, which, he does amend the law of value such that it's largely about the ability to exploit cheap natures in some ways, even if it's still, in principle, a law which is about the requirement to expand values. And he is constantly talking about like things that we would think of as core to the process of capitalism, whether it's like revolutionizing the productive process, whether it's making labor more efficient in some ways. But then all he's saying is all of these dynamics that we recognize as being potentially internal to capitalism require these processes of the appropriation from nature of sort of like cheap natures. So maybe he talks a lot about like sort of like cheap, when going back to that, like for every Manchester there's a Mississippi, did you say? Like it's only because of, say, cheap steel that allows for the laying of a sufficient quantity of rail track in America to sort of like facilitate the transportation of cotton from this frontier to the sort of core of capitalism, kind of thing. Or it's only because of the relationship between the expanding sort of agricultural output of North America, which he seems to fixate on quite a lot. He seems to talk quite a lot about like the sort of like frontier agrarian family in America, which is sort of gradually being drawn into the process, sort of the capitalist process, but in a way which has it also somewhat on the outside, kind of thing. So he talks a lot about like core dynamics of capitalism, but they're sort of like relationship to the periphery, kind of thing. It's very much like a core periphery argument. He says, I don't know whether that clarifies anything for you.
Well, I think so. I think definitely. I suppose it's just he like real. I think maybe he's just bending the stick. I hate it when people say that, but I think he is a bit, because he is like, nobody's focusing on my oikios or whatever. Like, and that's totally true. Like, no, even I think versions of socialism or communism or whatever that we've been quite taken with don't focus on this nearly enough. Like even like labor time planning doesn't take into account what that could potentially do to the environment. And so he is definitely right to be like, hey, everybody, we need to focus on this. And like now, because we're running out of these cheap natures, he's going to get to like his final crisis thing, I think, later in this book. But yeah, I mean, I think that's just what I felt. I think it just felt like he was maybe just bending the stick a bit too much, because it's like, well, the thing that's going to determine how we interact with nature, not to be like a dualist or whatever, like, is how we organize ourselves and getting rid of the value form, right? So, yeah, whatever.
One of the things that I found really interesting in this sections were when he was talking about the distinction between like nature, capital N nature, and what he was describing as historical nature. And I think in some respects, like every mode of production or every human being's interaction with nature is a historical nature in some respects, like it's a created nature. But then he talks quite a lot about capitalism's relationship to historical nature as opposed to nature in general, because nature in general versus capitalism or society in general would be kind of like a dualist argument, whereas in his effort to sort of like create a dialectic between the two, what he seems to put as that sort of like synthesis point is this idea of historical nature. And then that seems to imply that capitalism creates nature in some way, and this is coming back to this: capitalism creates nature in the same way that nature creates capitalism in some respects. But capitalism both creates nature, but then continually recreates nature almost. Every time there is the end of a boom and the beginning of a bust cycle, a beginning of a new phase of capitalist production, I suppose, every time capitalism discovers a new piece of free or cheap nature which it's ready to appropriate, it is through various technological or class relational I guess, transformations of its operation. It is creating a new type of nature by creating a new version of itself. And I guess in the similar respects, a new type of capitalism is created by the necessity of interacting with a new type of nature in some respects.
Yeah, and crucially too, I think that when his argument is about crisis is like when capitalism creates these new natures, it does it in a way that just completely shoots itself in the foot. And we'll get into this is a bit more complicated. We'll get into it in a bit, but it's basically just to think about, say, going in and leveling a rainforest so that you can plant a bunch of palm trees to make palm oil, right? Like, if that's the way it works. I don't know, coffee beans or whatever the fuck. You know what I mean? That's actually going to act as a hindrance on accumulation, because it's like, okay, in the short run, you're getting rid of this rainforest, whatever, replace it with something that can be much more profitable. But it's like, the argument for this specific one about the rainforest is that, like, what happens when we run out of rainforest? You're not going to be able to accumulate because the world will end, Dan. But also, like, there are things that are much more specific about, like, farming, right? Like, this is probably a much better example, because it's like, once you can only appropriate for natures for so long before you have to start capitalizing them and start treating them as like commodities. And one of the ways in which this is very apparent is in capitalist, really intensive agriculture. It's like farming up until like World War II in America was much more sustainable because it didn't have to be like this massive capitalized thing. You could just appropriate all of the little mycelium networks and all of the microbes in this like perfect soil in the Midwest, right? But now we've gotten to a point where you've appropriated all of that cheap energy that's in the soil. Basically, you've gone way past peak appropriation, and now everything has to be capitalized. So you're forced to kind of like trade in these things as commodities. And what that means is, like, for farmland, is that you have to put in more and more artificial fertilizers and things like that, which is a huge hindrance on accumulation, because like you need to put in more and more and more and more each season, and everything's just dead. It's just basically sand at this point, dirt, and you're only able to grow stuff because of the like massively energy intensive inputs that you put in. And that's why farming is basically like subsidized out the bloody wazoo, Dan. But yeah, this gets into a core bit of his argument, which is like, you can only appropriate for so long because of these fundamental laws of capitalism and competition, where, the market just basically runs its course. I think if I tried to explain that in like value theory terms, I'd kind of slip up. Just take my word on it.
Yeah, there's a really interesting aspect of this argument which I found really fascinating. He says something about capitalization and appropriation. He says that capitalism's main problem is not that it hasn't got enough capitalization. It's actually got too much.
Yeah,
At a certain point in time, too many things have been brought into the kind of like he makes capitalization synonymous with the sort of like commodity money circuit that we recognize from volume 1 of Capital. And so the more that things are brought into that sort of circuit of capitalism, the less they are representative of external natures, and the more they are representative of what you were described of like, okay, here is now something which we have to be responsible for the inputs for. We have to be responsible for attempting to, I guess, recreate the fertility of nature if we're thinking of the soil, and we become responsible for fertilizing the soil. But it becomes more energy intensive over time. There's more diminishing returns, I suppose. And I guess the same is true of like mining, for example, or logging, fracking. Like at a certain point in time, you can't go from like sort of tapping oil wells everywhere and just sort of getting it up really easily. You're going to have to put more labor, more technology, more fixed capital into a process which is more and more difficult to do. You've got to do like deep sea oil drilling, which he makes the point of like the result of this is like the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe or whatever. Or you've got to do tar sands, or you've got to do fracking, or you've got to do like chopping the top off mountains to get the raw materials underneath, kind of thing. And this is an example of like one of his 4 cheaps, i.e. the kind of like the, what does he call them? Raw materials,
energy,
and energy as well. In this instance, like cease to be cheap anymore, and become more and more labor intensive, more and more capitalized, more and more caught up in the sort of circulation of capital, and therefore less they contribute to a decline in the profitability of capitalism over time.
Yeah, totally. And I find that an incredibly compelling argument. I mean, it's just right? It's like, this is where his focus, saying like, okay, let's just for a little bit, I know that this is heresy, but let's take a step away from like labor and value production to kind of look at the things and exploitation and look at the things that are being appropriated. Because his argument is that those things are just as important to capitalism as actually exploiting the laborer. And, you see examples of this. Like, obviously, we think about, like, the boom of industrialism in 18th or 19th century England, the cotton mills and everything. It's like that was only able to happen because of mass-produced cotton made by slaves, right? Who were just completely appropriated people. Disgusting. But you see it now as well, right? When we brought this example up last episode about, for every Manchester, there's a Mississippi. For every Silicon Valley, like you said, there's a Democratic Republic of the Congo, where it is basically slave labor to get the cobalt and all of these things from mines to make all of our little iPads and our things that record our podcasts and things like that, right? So it's incredibly compelling. And as you said, like this idea of historical natures, we've come across this idea of Marx's spat with Malthus like a couple of times before. But this was his big, Malthus, his big mistake was thinking that limits to growth aren't historically determined. He was just like, too many poor people, we're all fucked, we're all gonna die, whatever. And Marx was like, well, no, duh, because steam engine, cotton gin, like, you know what I mean? So, yeah, limits to growth is being historically determined, I find really interesting. And that would get into a bigger conversation about what growth would be under socialism and stuff like that. But maybe we can just table that for right now. Should we take a stab then at the like kind of general theory of underproduction that comes up? Because he does talk about overaccumulation and, well, overproduction. A theory of like overaccumulation is very simple, kind of. It's just like, we're seeing this now. It's just like too much wealth or whatever has been transferred to like the capitalists. Now nobody in the working class has money to buy the things the capitalists are making. Everybody's kind of fucked, right? That's relatively simple. But I think if we want to talk about the theory of underproduction, which is very similar to this, but yeah, I think we probably should. And it's going to, for the listener, I think it's going to, if you haven't come across this idea before, it's going to seem a little bit complicated, but I think that that's only because there are just some new vocabulary terms, maybe, that like if you haven't come across before, you're going to be like, what the fuck? But I promise it is all very simple. To kind of really quickly go through it, it's this idea that there are two types of capital that the capitalist has to invest if they're like running a factory or something like that to produce. You have variable capital and constant capital. Variable capital is so-called because it's basically just labor, and that's the only thing that you can vary to get how much you can get like more value out of, right? It's the only thing that you can get more value out of. Constant capital is so-called because it just has the value that it has, and this is, as opposed to labor, this is like the machines, the buildings, the raw material inputs. And here, Moore is really putting the emphasis on a specific part of constant capital, which is circulating capital, which is the raw material inputs. Fixed capital is the other part of constant capital, and again, this is just, you don't need to know all of these words, but it's basically just the machines and the buildings and everything like that, whereas circulating capital is the raw materials. The theory of underproduction then goes that because of competition, the fixed capital, the machines, the buildings, things like that, the capitalist has to invest some of their profit into that to basically up labor productivity, right? But that comes at the cost of raw materials and circulating capital. So all the theory is just that fixed capital grows at a much higher rate than circulating capital, basically just leading to, this would also get into the tangential flow and the rate of profit, which we don't need to get into, but basically here leading to an underproduction of material inputs. And what he's saying here is that those material inputs are vitally important because those are the things that are appropriated really easily. And once you run out of those, once you underproduce on those enough, then you're kind of fucked and you have to find a new organizational form, kind of. You have to find a new frontier. And he hasn't gotten to this yet, but I get the feeling, Dan, he's going to say that we're out of frontiers.
I spent all of these reading these 3 chapters waiting to see whether we were going to get to the point where is this a secular or is this a cyclical crisis? And at the end of of chapter 6, he does sort of suggest that we've reached sort of not necessarily a final crisis, but there is a diminishing return every time capitalism has to recreate nature for itself, create a new form of historical nature. The sort of material that it has to tap into is less forthcoming, I guess, or less generous in what it has for capitalism to work with. But at the same time, I think it's probably worth reiterating that he's kind of, when it comes back to this avoidance of a dualistic relationship between society or capitalism and nature, he does also seem to be pointing toward the possibility of capitalism always reconfiguring itself, or at least he makes the argument that in a lot of ways capitalism doesn't tap into nature. It's not like nature is out there and capitalism sort of like puts some kind of like horrible tendril into it and starts to sap its vitality or whatever. I don't know where I'm going with this. It's pretty gross. But rather the specific type of nature which capitalism is exploiting is a type of nature which is created by the particular dynamics of any phase of capitalism, kind of thing. Capitalism almost creates its own constraints in some ways. So it creates the possibility for a boom, but then also by virtue of the dynamics that it puts in place, by virtue of the type of historical nature that it creates, through the kind of like intermediate durée of the sort of like 70-year cycle or whatever, the rules that it puts in place that allow it to find a new vitality are what then comes to fetter it through the process as the logic of any particular historical nature plays itself out, I suppose. So although there are serious hints of a final crisis, of a secular decline, I think it's definitely worth remembering that element of his argument, and that's the one that he might want to ensure that we all take away, is that just because perhaps there is some kind of like secular decline going on, that is, those failings of capitalism are a result of capitalism itself, kind of thing. Capitalism is the fetter. Capitalism is the crisis. It's not nature's fault, I suppose.
Yeah.
The diminishing returns are not, and it's not, but it's not nature's fault because it's not willing to give more, nor is it capitalism's fault because it's like reaping so vociferously, but the rules of the relationship that capitalism has created with nature are fettering in and of themselves, kind of thing. And he doesn't really get into it this time, but I feel like in the first 3 chapters there were hints of this argument, and we did talk about it, of kind of like a different social relationship would have a different relationship to nature, which might not be destructive in the same way.
One would hope.
One would hope. Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right to bring that up. And I think, I've definitely been reading this. I got carried away and I was like, final crisis, dude, it's coming. Because he hints at it a little bit, but you're absolutely right to bring that back up. It is definitely relational. Because I've been thinking very much in this about the 4 cheaps. What are the ones that he could hint at later in the book that are being exhausted? Because there is it is relational and everything, but there is like a quantitative amount of like, obviously fossil fuels, we'd want to get past that, but also like things like uranium, like all energy inputs save like, I guess like solar, but then how do you harvest solar? You need like all of these different materials, et cetera, et cetera. Tidal power, Dan. That's the solution to nothing. But then I was thinking about like, well, maybe it could be food. But then it's like one could very much imagine capitalism creating a new historical nature where people, this is over the top, but like instead of eating meat because it wastes everything, people just eat crickets. You know what I mean? And like we get our protein from that. So yeah. Maybe there's just more doom to go. Maybe I was like, oh, cool. All the doom is almost done. One final doom. But then I guess you have to get into the problem of like catastrophic climate change. But I don't know. This is a question I wrestle with a lot of how ecologically speaking, how bad could things get before capitalism can't operate anymore? And I've always been tempted to say that there is an absolute limit. But maybe there isn't. Maybe it can just keep revolutionizing itself in increasingly worse and worse, more and more grim ways. He does say, though, that we hit peak appropriation. And I was like, oh, when did we hit peak appropriation? In the 80s? And he's like, 1870. It's like, oh my God. So I don't know. I guess this is a question for like when we finish the book, because he'll hopefully get to it. But I wonder.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, actually. I was doing a similar process of like, what if we take these cheaps, how can I think of any ways in which capitalism could revivify some of these cheaps or make cheap again some of these essential things? And I was thinking about food as well, only because like I've heard George Monbiot's been wrote a book recently about food, and he's been going on quite a lot about food and sort of like growing protein in some kind of like fermentation process. We'll just all end up eating like the dead husks of some kind of bacteria or whatever. I mean, it's not exciting. It's the stuff of like dystopia, I suppose, in some respects. Maybe it's not. But perhaps it does represent some kind of like new technological fix that will discover some type of nature yet to be exploited. And it does present an interesting thought experiment, or an interesting version of this argument, because one could fall into the trap of being like, we need to discover some new vein of some kind of ore, or we need to discover some new continent on Earth to go off and exploit, kind of thing. And those are the frontiers that have yielded the greatest impact on the development of capitalism, you know. But we could think of it in terms of like some kind of new capitalist technology giving us access to some kind of frontier, I suppose. I mean, maybe they ought to just like hurry up with the asteroid mining, and
they should hurry up
maybe
with
that'll
that.
represent it. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, maybe that needs to frame our thinking about, at least about socialism, not necessarily about capitalism, but about like, how is it that we can just get past appropriation, period? Because if we ever want to have a like completely 100%, and this is like way in the future, even way beyond like the revolution or whatever, right? Like, how is it that we can actually get past appropriation once and for all and like live in perfect harmony on the cover of a Murray Bookchin book? You know what I mean? Like, how is it that like we can basically balance this relation, which is the same thing or whatever, it's the web of life, but like, you know, realistically speaking, how is it that we can stop appropriating natures and all have food forests? Like, is that the solution? Because obviously he talks about the division between town and country as being like a huge antagonism in this relationship, or maybe like something symptomatic of it. And you would need to get rid of that, but it seems like a tall order. And it, you know, as like taken as I was with the fundamental principle stuff, it's like, would simply getting rid of the value form and producing for utility democratically solve this question? Maybe. It would be a lot better than what we have now, but also maybe not, you know? So it's more complicated, I guess, than simply just producing for utility, although let's go for that.
Yeah, I mean, my first instinct is to say, yes, we just need to get rid of that fundamental tenet of capitalism, which says we need to expand values, kind of thing. And once we, as you say, like overthrow the law of value,
it's an easy first step.
Yeah. But quite what the relationship to historical nature will be under the early phase of a transition to socialism.
I suppose it's something to do with subsumption, right? It's like real subsumption, formal subsumption. It's like, you know, first of all, we like get rid of that. And then second, and we use what we have, and then we start to, you know, we use what we have in a better way, meaning like technologies and factories and things like that. And then eventually we create something new, I suppose. It's not just going to happen like, boom, you live on a, you know, farm or whatever. So, yeah, I don't know. What else is there to get to here, Dan? I mean, I guess one thing that I thought was interesting, we can kind of go back a bit, is how he talks about capitalization's like priorities of these kind of like appropriations or whatever. He says, I'm just going to quote him here. He says, capitalization has two priorities. One is to squeeze more work and energy out of older appropriated zones, as in post-war American agriculture. Another is to render more efficient the industrial processing of cheap natures appropriated elsewhere, as in the successive industrial revolutions. So that's actually also kind of like a type of real informal subsumption, right? Like, as I said kind of earlier, like American agriculture pre-World War II was like very different. I'm not saying it was like perfect or anything, but it was able to like use the nutrients and the microbial networks and stuff like that in the soil to basically like produce in a much better way. But now it's like capitalize these things. It's no longer really like appropriating them, which is worse for everybody, including the capitalists, but they have literally like no choice but to do this. So, yeah, that's very compelling. Very disturbing, but very compelling. It's also, I always, like every now and then I kind of just want to be like, you know, where is the relationship between like a concrete individual capitalist and all of this value trading? Like, do they understand what they're doing? Do they understand that it's all value and what they're doing is kind of like contradictory, or are they just in it to get it? I kind of just wish they knew what they were doing. I don't think they do. I don't think they have any idea. But like, oh man, yeah.
If only.
If only I could just go to the capitalist and be like, solve this for me.
Well, I mean, even if they knew what they were doing, they still wouldn't be able to overcome the contradiction of it.
Yeah, exactly.
So
yeah.
What you're hoping for is their conversion to socialism.
Yeah, exactly.
Which has not been unheard of for members of the bourgeoisie to come over to the side of the proletariat. So
that's very true.
Who knows? Yeah, I mean, one of the things I was thinking about earlier on and meant to say was in this relationship with this idea of like, is there a final crisis coming? Is there a final crisis in the relationship between nature and capitalism? Is capitalism depleted of all of the free inputs, kind of thing? And in some ways, it's hard to imagine anything like what has happened before happening again, kind of thing. There isn't, as I say, a new continent to be discovered, kind of thing. There aren't agricultural workers existing on the periphery of capitalism who are willing to trade with the core but maintain some kind of different social relation at the same time, such that they continue to be external and non-capitalized, kind of thing. There aren't a billion Chinese workers ready to transition from being peasants external to the capitalist social relation to one's central and core to it, kind of thing. So it certainly does feel like there aren't new frontiers.
Yeah. It's funny because when I said, like, he said peak appropriation was 1870 or whatever, around then, I was a little bit like, damn, that was a long time ago. But in the grand scheme of things, it very much wasn't. And all of those examples that you're using, it's like astonishing how quickly capitalism uses up cheap natures. And like cheap labor in terms of, like, as you're saying, like this like unheard of amount of people, well-educated peasants who are just like immediately able to jump into the labor force and just up productivity in China, like, you know, a lot. Like, that was very recently in the grand scheme of things. And it's like, oh, it's all going downhill. You know what I mean? It's insane.
Yeah. One of the examples he uses is one that we've come across before, which is I mean, he's going to talk about it very much more in this book later on, is the conquest of South America, I think. And he talks quite a lot about mining in South America. And what he actually says was there was a very rapid boom and then actually quite a quick bust, only in 30 or 40 years, in terms of the output from South America and what could be appropriated by Europe, kind of thing. And I think this was the phase of strict appropriation, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then it sort of transitions into the process of being capitalized, and then you get Potosi, and then you get the use of mercury in the refining of silver. Then you get more deliberate and intentional enslaving of the population, and this is this gradual process of being drawn into capitalization, kind of thing. But I guess this is coming back to what I was saying earlier about his identifying capitalism as starting very early on, because there's a period of there's a section in this book when he's talking about like the centers of world mining in like the 1400s or something, as being in like Eastern and Central Europe or whatever, and that being a free input from nature, which is sort of like outdone at a certain point and results in a crisis. And he starts this cycle of appropriation and crisis very early on in what we will conceptualize as history. So when he says that the point of peak appropriation was 1870 or whatever, it's quite late in terms of the history that he is presenting, one which starts in the mid 1400s or something.
It's interesting also, like, you can kind of finally see here where he's getting his Wallerstein influence from. And comparing this to like the Brennerite thesis of the origins of capitalism, it almost seems like it's asking two different questions. They think they're asking the same question about like, where did capitalism come from, man? But like, yeah, I don't know. They're very much concerned with the like qualitative change in labor relations, the Brennerites, I mean, whereas like he's very much concerned with like what's being appropriated. Let's look around, what's being appropriated. And that's a bit of a slippery slope, I think, because like, what was our reading that we did where we came across the appropriation that happened in England, like specifically in it, like leading up to the 1200s, that specifically of like this class conflict between like peasants and lords looking to like appropriate new natures for themselves, and they kind of like cut down all forests. What was that?
Perry Anderson, was it?
Yeah, I think it was the Perry Anderson. Yeah. That's like an example of non-capitalist, I would say, maybe. Oh, I don't know. Do I want to say that? But like non-capitalist appropriation of natures, where like this was not necessarily a capitalist relationship between peasant and lord, right? Like obviously. But as these people like, there was this antagonism that led them to like appropriate nature more. So I suppose if you're only looking for when we appropriated stuff on a large scale, I don't know if that's the best measurement for when capitalism began, but maybe that's not what he's saying. Yeah. I don't know.
I wonder whether the two things can be synthesized in some way, because I think of the Brennerite argument as being, where did the logic come from? And it's possible that there was this sort of like shift in the logic of the relationship between classes, such that a new class relationship appeared in England in whatever date, 15 something or 14 something or 15 something, and that can coincide with a process of what Ellen Minx's Wood might identify as being like feudal colonialism in South America, interacting with the sort of early nascent stages of a new capitalist logic, and then how did that new capitalist logic feed back into this process of appropriation? Or can you even have a feudal process of appropriation of resources from South America that then feeds into the development of capitalism in Western Europe, say, even though the direct beneficiaries of that process, the sort of like Spanish aristocracy kind of thing, as we identified when we did whatever reading it was we did on
Eduardo
that topic.
Galeano.
When we read the Eduardo Galeano. And he's very much like, these stupid Spanish aristocrats didn't like invest any of this stuff. They just spent it on palaces and whatever.
But to be fair, I think that like all of these things need to be synthesized, and you need to take out the bad bits. Like, but primitive accumulation was hugely important. Like, obviously, the Brennerite stuff is much more qualitative. The like Galeanite, I guess, I don't know, just theory of capitalism came from primitive accumulation is very quantitative. And this is like appropriation, man, which leads to a qualitative change. It's kind of quantitative into qualitative, actually. All of that can be synthesized because Marx also talks quite a bit about how, and Galeano quotes him kind of out of context a little bit, as being like primitive accumulation with all of this wealth flowing in did hugely help like capitalism become a thing. And it definitely did. And Marx talks about in Capital about how a quantitative increase is completely necessary of people working in factories right next to each other and the number of laborers to get the measure of value. So for abstract like labor. So yeah, it all, I guess, needs to be synthesized.
But for Marx, central to the process of primitive accumulation is the change in social relations far more than the sort of crude primitive accumulation. This is
but it's also
deny what you're saying. This is to like,
exactly.
It needs those inputs.
Exactly. Yeah. It's necessary and all these things. Blah 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 blah. But yeah, we got to find something else to synthesize as well, because I really like all this historical capitalism garbage.
Some new history, some more history, something else entirely. Maybe some science.
Some science. Yeah, this is all very good. I don't think I have anything left to say on this part necessarily. There was one bit where he said that like coal only replaced charcoal in America as the primary energy source in like 1880. I read that and I just went, what? That's insane. They were still using like charcoal then? Yeah. That's nuts. Yeah, what are you going to do? All of the bits, I think, as well about... you touched on this earlier about like the American kind of like frontier family unit as being hugely important to this kind of like idea of appropriation, because obviously they were appropriating what was in the soil, they're appropriating the land, all of this stuff. But there's also this idea of like central to that unit that like it created this form of like patriarchal appropriation where suddenly like it was just like, the guy was able to just like not pay his wife and like kids to do all of this work on the farm, right? Which is necessary. And that kind of gets into like where he's influenced in a lot of his thinking about like radical feminism, ecofeminism, as well as being like unpaid house labor and stuff like that. Appropriation. So
yeah, that didn't come up very much in these three chapters, did it? That stuff that was in the first few about an important free input to capitalism being the unpaid work of women, say, or people doing social work, things that reproduce the worker without being directly included in sort of like process of capitalization, I suppose, things that stand outside of it. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, we all definitely like to think, obviously, because capitalism is this global system, that like everything is capitalized, but it's like very much in capitalism's interest for everything not to be capitalized. And I think that that's a really, important, at least for me, like, it's called paradigm shift, because it's very much like, oh shit. And then you start to realize like all of the stuff that is unpaid and that isn't necessarily exploited. And it's all just like slowly slipping out of the capitalist hands in a very morbid way. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to think, because we do think of capitalism as being this process which is seeking more and more control over everything, kind of thing. But it only needs control over what it needs control over. And as I identified in this book, there are reasons why it would want to not have control, kind of thing, or it would like to keep things external to its circulating processes.
And I suppose we haven't mentioned that like one of the four chiefs, labor. One of the reasons that like that very importantly can't continue forever is like we've kind of undersold like class struggle because like there is this antagonism where you can't keep appropriating people forever because there is this like people have agency and they're not going to take it anymore, right? I mean, like we're seeing that more and more now with people who are exploited. So we'll see how long what is left of appropriated labor, or at least cheap labor, I suppose I should say, can be kept up.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of those. This is just an aside now, but going back to that reference of 1 billion Chinese workers coming into the workforce in the 80s and 90s kind of thing, one of the things, because we hear a lot at the moment in the UK, and I would imagine in the US as well, like real wages have been falling for the past 30 years kind of thing. And one of the things that has allowed that fall in wages to happen, one of those things that has allowed wages to stay cheap, quote unquote, is all of these kind of like cheap consumer durables that have been produced in China and sort of brought over here so that you can have a toaster for £10 or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
So there is this sort of like, there is external, this comes back to one of the things he reiterates quite a lot throughout this book, is it's not just one thing, it's not just one input that keeps everything cheap, you know. He pushes back a bit against the idea that like it was solely coal in the 19th century which sort of like was central to the Industrial Revolution and that phase of capitalism, that phase of boom and bust in capitalism kind of thing, but how everything is interlinked. And this is another example of like peasant workers being drawn into the process of capitalism is allowing for the maintenance of cheap labor in the Western world kind of thing. So it's all connected.
It is all connected. It's all dialectical. I just remembered the last thing I'd like to bring up. I know that he, in this we get, I'm always interested now whenever people bring up technology as kind of like a motivating force in societies and in history, because we, from very early on in doing the show, we're like, technological determinism, bad. But he brings up how important, like, the technologies that allowed for global relations to become capitalist, say like a globe-spanning system of trains, how important that was to capitalism and how important that was to basically like appropriation, because it allowed for like the global hegemony of these relations, of capitalist relationships, but it also allowed for the like global appropriation and easy appropriation of things like, I don't know, coal fields in Siberia or something like that. And obviously very much like the trains in America and things like that. So it is interesting, like he touches on all of the bases, and he definitely has the like things in history, appropriation, ecology, the oikos or whatever, that are his like driving factors, obviously, you know, like social relationships as well. But he also doesn't leave things out. And like it's like this book is very much like it's determined kind of by everything. And so when he had this section on like, if you just took it out of context, would be like technological determinism, I was like, oh, this is interesting. This is really, really cool. Because you can't forget about like, these things are important. The cotton gin, things like that. But like, you know, what is it that allowed for these things to be made, et cetera, et cetera. It's all connected. It's a web of life.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting point. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. But it's definitely not a technological determinism that he's presenting kind of thing. It's almost the other way around. It's almost the myriad social relations of capitalism, which include the social relationship between capitalism and nature, I guess, create circumstances of decline and crisis which necessitate revolutionizing both the class relationship but also There are types of technology that there are in existence to mediate human relationships with nature. And so technological development is almost a result of various different pre-existing crises from the pre-existing mode of capitalist accumulation, I guess. So it's all an interconnected natural historical.
It's all very cyclical and maybe I should say circular, because this is kind of one of the reasons that it's kind of hard to talk about. It's because it's like there is no starting point. It really isn't an end point in talking about like technology is determined by this, which is determined by this, which is determined by this, which is determined by technology, which is determined by this. So it's really an interesting, like, at least exercise in thinking, I guess, dialectically, but also just like, yeah, so I dig it. We got to get through like 140 more pages. We should just finish it. We'll see.
We'll see if we can just blitz it.
But yeah, I really dug this. Looking forward to getting to it. And hopefully we don't just read ecology from here on out, but I am up for just reading ecology from here on out. We'll see.
No, we'll think of something exciting and different to read.
Yeah, History of the Windsors is what we'll read.
Why not?
Why not? All right. Yeah, that's about it. We will be back soon. This has been very exciting. I feel like even though we've been doing these on a 2 weekly basis, I feel like the more time is happening in between them. I don't know why. It feels like it's longer.
More than 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Little peek behind the veil. It has been 3 weeks since we recorded the last one. That's why.
Oh, well, that's why. Wow, you're right. It's absolutely right. This episode is going up in like 12 hours.
Yeah. Yeah, we've got to stop recording this so I can go and edit it.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you to the listener. Thank you to Dan. And thank you to Jason W. Moore. We'll be back again.
Yep. God bless. Thanks for listening. Bye.
The music you heard this episode was Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. If you like this song, you can check it out and much, much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. Be sure and follow us up on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And if you liked what you heard, be sure and tune in next week for some more commie discussion. Till next time.